Okay, so if we can start at a high level and then maybe drill down a little bit into the practicalities, just really what is the potential for floating solar power?
Sure. I think the best way to approach this is to look, like I say, breaking it down, is looking at the global picture initially, very quickly, and then bring that down to the UK and where we're at there. From a global perspective, if you look at where we're at with floating solar, we're currently sitting at around 6 gigawatts of installed capacity of floating solar. Now, don't worry about the metric, the gigawatt metric. To give you some benchmark of how does that sit alongside other renewables, right now in comparison, we're looking at around about 1,500 gigawatts of ground-mounted and rooftop solar globally. So you've got 6 of floating and 1,500 of other scale. So it's quite small in terms of its overall capacity. So it still is very much in its infancy. So that's kind of the global side of things. In terms of the potential globally, there's estimates been calculated in recent times that are looking at around something like 3 times the amount of energy demand there is in Europe in potential globally. Just again, to give a sense of scale. The problem is with these things, you can get a lot of jargon and a lot of gigawatts and terawatts and anything else just to round it on a kind of geographical range. So it's, again, very, very significant potential, even though it is far, far behind the other solar technologies. Within the UK, I think what helps is to look at what we've had in terms of targets in the past number of years. And you may well have seen that the government in recent years quoting this 70 gigawatts, there's the gigawatts again. So there's 70 gigawatts of generation by 2035. And there's a roadmap that's being produced as we speak. The election, like with everything, could put a halt on that for the time being, but we can see that Labour are doubling down on a lot of these targets. So I think we can feel relatively safe in the notion that that's still a target that's very much front and centre. Now, again, where we are in terms of what sort of context we have at the moment is we've got about 16 gigawatts of solar installed in the UK at the moment. So you've got your 70 as a target by 2035. Right now, we've only got 16 operating as you and I sit here right now. We've got another 20 in the system. And what I mean by that is there's 10 of that 20 that is ready to build. But there's another 10 of that that's going through our planning system to get consent. So you could suggest maybe by the end of this decade, we could be looking at least maybe 35, 40 gigawatts. So around about half of that target in 2035 would be sort of fulfilled, if you like, by other forms of solar. But it doesn't take a genius to work out that's quite a target if we've got 5 years left and still to get double the amount. Give or take a few gigawatts. So there's the point I want to make there is there's headroom there for other technologies to come in and help with that cause. And I think, that's a kind of notional potential for floating solar to contribute. In terms of what its actual potential is, there aren't too many figures like there are on the global scale for the UK, but we've done a little bit of number crunching. And if you take the large majority of reservoirs in the UK, we reckon you could be looking at around about 40, 50 gigawatts potential. If you just completely cover the water surface. Now, you're probably not going to do that. There will be constraints like existing users, environmental constraints. There's the proximity to national grid infrastructure if you want to export the energy. All those things will play into reducing that potential. But you still could probably sit around about maybe 10 or 20 gigawatts, if not more. And again, I just refer you back to that 70 gigawatt benchmark. You can see that's quite a significant contribution. So, as you look, certainly in the UK, there is a very large potential. And the good news for the water sector is that they have ownership control of a large portion of that, which is, be it putting energy on the grid or be it using a good part of that energy themselves. So it's a very significant opportunity, I think.
I'm presuming just before I think we drill down a bit, I guess that planning permissions and the worry of covering loads of fields, which we potentially need to, grow crops, etc. Yeah. Potentially it's attractive for that point of view as well. And people object to having, fields full of solar panels near them, whereas a reservoir potentially won't have the same impact. Is that so? It might be easier to do as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'm a fan of renewable energy just as a person, and I always go back to the solutions for any country are a mix by and large, depending upon the resource you have. As we well know in the UK, we don't lack wind, and And we perhaps don't have as much solar resources as the places, but we do have enough and a lot of potential. But there has been this tension, as you say, between, I guess, what we've heard called food security in recent times and energy security. So the two butting against each other. There's another discussion there around about how much of a tension there actually is in reality. But no, you're right. I think one of the things with floating solar is that one of the main benefits is you're not taking otherwise valuable land, be it for food, commercially. We're looking and talking to minerals operators, and clearly in that situation on their land, they want to protect the minerals on the land, but to be able to put something in like a solar farm but not affect that is quite a valuable aspect of floating solar. So on the other side, in the spirit of balance, clearly you are restricted to where water is with floating solar. So let's be honest about that. But I think there are a lot of applications where it really does help with protecting other land resource for use for other matters.
Okay, and in terms of the practicalities, what's the process for identifying and then installing and operating? What's involved from start to building and operating that installation?
When you're first looking for a site, I mean, I suppose ideally the basics you're looking for is the water body itself, and typically it's a static water body. You can, in theory, put it on a water course, a river, or what have you. There have attempts been made, so in Asia in particular, where floating solar has taken off a lot more than perhaps certainly in the UK. But you're looking for a static water body primarily. It doesn't have to be that deep. You're talking a matter of a metre or so. It doesn't have to be some deep water. I'm sure we'll touch on some of those sort of metrics later on, but it's a fairly basic requirement around that. Different companies will require a minimum size of water body. I mean, we're looking at something around maybe a couple of 100 square meters, maybe is perhaps what you want to start with in terms of making it effective. But then the next thing you need, ideally, is an energy user, one way or other. Now, that might be a grid connection point, so you stick it out onto the energy grid for everybody else to use, or ideally for this situation you've got what they call a behind the meter solution, or a local provision of energy. So essentially you're running a wire from the installation across the field to an end user on site. So you can imagine the water sector sense. If you've got a water treatment plant on site next to a reservoir, you've got it on the reservoir, you're on a cable down to the water treatment works, and it's as simple as that. But you obviously want an end user for the energy you're generating. And those are probably the two main fundamentals. The other aspect you're looking for as well is existing users, environmental sensitivities, those sorts of things, because they matter in the round in terms of whether you'll be able to build them or not. So that's your starting point in identifying them. In terms of then getting through to construction, it's very similar to any sort of capital projects that you would invest in any sector, really. The good old planning permission, which we all gnash our teeth at an awful lot and get frustrated at, and so do the determining authorities. They struggle with resource very often. So we go through that battle that can often happen in securing planning consent. In certain aspects, and I think with floating solar, what's quite interesting in that phase of the works is that with water companies and also with ports and harbours, for example, there are permitted development rights available. And actually the leading edge of this, which has been around for a few years, has been led by the water companies. So there's a few floating solar assets out there at the minute and have gone through planning through permitted development rights. So for certain sectors, that phase might not be quite as painful as maybe for others. So, but still, we need to go through that process. Once you've secured consent, floating solar does have a certain degree of advantage over the ground-mounted solar side of things, because it's, I guess, what you'd call modular. So if you imagine Meccano, you can kind of fabricate big chunks of the units in a factory, and then transport that to site, and essentially, in basic terms, bolt it together on site. So the deployment is quite rapid. Compared to ground-mounted solar, where you're basically taking the components to site, largely speaking, and constructing on site as you go. Ground-mounted solar is fairly quick, but floating solar does have that advantage of being able to do a lot of the heavy lifting, so to speak, off-site and then construct on site. So you put the floating panels out. The essential ingredient there then is the moorings and the anchorings, so making sure that it isn't just floating around on the water surface. I think with the water sector, the real sensitivities around the integrity of the bed of the reservoir would always come into play, and all the infrastructure. And largely speaking, you would tend to defer to moorings if you can onto the bank, so that you're not interfering with the integrity of the structure. But you, depending on what you're dealing with, you can deal with either anchors to the bed and or the mooring lines, and then a cable out from the installation to behind the meter to an installation, or linking it up to grid. And then after that point, the operation and maintenance is actually quite low intensity. It's largely about just checking on the electricals and the various workings, and occasional cleaning. Clearly, compared to ground-mounted solar, the cleaning exercise needs to be a little bit more sensitive to the environment. So with reservoirs, for example, you tend to lean towards just using the water within the reservoir. So essentially, nothing's going in there that wasn't already in there, or would have ended up in there, if you like, if something's landed on top of the panel. So yes, it's pretty light touch once you're constructed and operating. So that's the process. All in with a moderate size, maybe megawatt size sort of scheme. You may be talking, if you have to do planning, that's probably the bulk of the timescale. 8 to 10 months, maybe a year if you're struggling to get through planning, and maybe only a handful of weeks then to deploy it. So you could arguably say probably a year from cradle to grave if everything went as planned. Committed development rights obviously a lot shorter, but that's the kind of general process.
And in terms of the potential, I mean, you covered it in the main, but just to re-emphasize, you've got sort of microgrids, as I understand it, to supplying the people, as you say, the water companies who own the reservoirs, for example. That's the perfect thing. But there is also the potential to supply into the grid as well. So any idea of the sort of the ratios of those two types of use? Or?
For the most part, in renewables, generally, you'll tend to find that the majority of generation that has happened to date, so ground-mounted solar, wind farms, offshore wind, the scale at which most of them are developed have generally been put onto grid. But I think if you go back to solar, my understanding is that the 16 gigawatts I mentioned before of solar that we've got powering away, today, around about, I would say about 6 gigawatts of that is roof-mounted solar. And so the larger part, the sort of 9 or 10 or so, is ground-mounted solar. Now, most of the ground-mounted solar will be linked into the grid, feeding everybody around the country, essentially. The rooftop will almost invariably be feeding the factory it sits on, or the house, or whatever it might be. There are certain other sort of microgrids, like you say, where you're feeding into something like that. And actually, a really good example is the Thames Water QE2 reservoir, where I believe from that perspective, they're not just feeding an individual asset, they're feeding into Thames Water's microgrid, if you like, for want of a better word. So it's whether it's a single wire or feeding into a local grid network, it's there's not enough of that, I would say. And I think there is an issue which you may be aware of with our grid system in the UK, where National Grid and the district network operators are trying to catch up, for want of a better phrase. The amount of energy is now coming online and is requiring to come online to the transition. There's a lot of difficulty in terms of the capacity, the space on the grid, the infrastructure to carry the electrons, essentially. So you're getting grid offers to different developers that are out to 2035, beyond the target date, in a sense. So I think the more you can self-generate, if you like, and you can use the energy where you generate it, and the less burden you're putting on the grid, the better. So I think it's something that, again, can be done with all the technologies. But again, with floating solar, I think particularly around certain sectors is an important part of it.
And in terms of suitable locations, obviously we mentioned reservoirs and water companies. I'm guessing lakes, and then you mentioned, I think, ports and harbours. So, and presumably because they're the water, they're somewhat protected from the elements. That's okay. So you couldn't float it in sort of open sea, but as long as it's sort of sheltered, that's possible. So yeah, just what sort of water bodies are suitable?
Yeah, I think pretty much as you said it. I think the way that we see it is we break it down into three target audiences, if you like, in terms of who might want to look at it. The first one we'd say is the onshore terrestrial water bodies, fresh water, I tend to call them, I suppose. So, and that can be a lake, reservoir. You've got the quarry pits, which very often are just, brownfield standing bits of water with not doing an awful lot as such. And then you've got the ports and harbours, which are what we would tend to then call the near shore. So you've got the kind of the onshore freshwater, and then you've got that near shore environment, which is mostly the ports and harbours. Like you say, you've got that bit of protection, and you can essentially deploy the same technology more or less. You might need to just change the design a little bit to make it more robust. We do see a third strand to that, which is in the marine environment and actually right out in the sea. And there are some trials being done at the moment in Holland around that. They have been leading on a lot of this, and the offshore wind fraternity are being asked to consider putting floating solar in amongst the wind turbines. That's starting to emerge as a concept. But clearly, as you've alluded to, it's a very different structure. You've got 10, 20 meter high waves coming in. The structure that you would have for freshwater, you're typically talking about a meter or two height in terms of structure floating on the surface. These sorts of things would be 10 meters, 15 meter high structures with the panels on top of them, in theory, looking at the different sizes of things. So commercially, if you said today, what could you roll out? Very much the freshwater, absolutely. There's no problem with that. You can do that. It commercially makes sense in most cases. In the nearshore environment, ports and harbours, again, you can do that. Offshore, we're still in that kind of proof of concept phase, I would say. So it will come, but I think the time horizons are probably 5-10 years from now, I would think, if you include for the consenting required and that kind of thing as well. So fascinating stuff, but in terms of commercials, it's quite a way off at the moment. So.
And in terms of the impacts on the site, I think you mentioned earlier that you potentially aren't going to cover the whole of the water surface, but clearly a lot of reservoirs, for example, have sailing clubs, people go fishing, etc. So is it reasonably practical in most cases? You think you can have some floating solar and potentially not have too much impact on other sort of leisure activities that might be going on? And similarly in a port or harbour, I guess it depends how busy it is, but clearly you've got ships coming in and out, etc. So is it possible, do you think, by and large, to manage floating solar alongside sort of other activities?
Yeah. I think there's some fundamentals there that you've alluded to that we need to respect, and they can be quite black and white in a way. There's no reason why the installation can't coexist with whatever's existing within the water body, whether that be the operations of the water body in of itself, or that be respecting the users, whether the sailing clubs, yachting clubs, that sort of thing. The issues you really need to pay attention to are obviously the footprint of those activities, and there may be a negotiation there if you're taking a little bit of an area which they do use, but they're happy to give that up in a sense. But the other side of that is we want to be sure in doing this that the safety of the public and the users is paramount, because in one sense you don't want it to be a structure that causes problems from the perspective of sailing, for example, if it's something where you can have an issue of a collision and the like. But also, people are people. You put something in the water, they probably feel like they need to go and swim over to it, and maybe there's a diving board there suddenly appeared. And joking aside, it's a serious concern. We obviously don't want damage to the structure, but equally we do not want people exploring and then ending up injuring themselves. So there's a serious matter there of looking at that. So in principle, there's no reason why they can't coexist. I suspect what tends to happen with any of these things when you're looking at, go back to that choice of site aspect of things. I think if you were given the choice, you would choose not to go somewhere where there's obvious leisure activity or uses there originally. Try and make sure you develop those sites first, and then you look at those where there's a bit more of an interaction with other uses. But by no means would you necessarily exclude them. You can design it, and in fact, we're looking at some work in ports where the port authorities are saying, well, the port operators are saying that you can put it in a certain corner of the port. They'll put buoys out and they'll make sure it's built into their navigational management to ensure that nothing goes near it and there's no unlikely to be any incidents. So it's all about, as always, consultation, building those conversations in, making sure everybody's aware of what's going in. So, but it will, I think they will. Those sorts of things will have an effect on the amount of deployment ultimately. And look, we're not suggesting for a minute you're going to carpet every water body with panels. That would be a little bit ludicrous, to be honest. I think you realise that there are benefits of the panels being over the water, but ultimately it may well be that on an average you maybe only take up maybe a quarter of any given water body with the panels, because there might be other uses, or environmentally it might not make sense to do that. So I think it's a bit of horses for courses a little bit.
Extreme weather conditions. I mean, again, you've referenced it to do with the size of the waves, depending on where the location is. But also thinking, I mean, for reservoirs, the water companies, once in a while when it isn't raining,
yeah,
we do get droughts. But you potentially answered it, because you say if you're only covering, say, a quarter of the surface, even if it shrinks by quite a lot, you're still okay. But is that a potential problem? If the reservoir gets really empty, then the sort of solar panels end up sort of high and dry, or?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's again it's all in sort of design really. The key thing, there's two aspects there. The one aspect in terms of the environmental forces on a floating solar installation. If you have a sizable lake, then you'll know, if you've stood by one, that it has, I guess, what you'd call in basic terms wave action. It's not quite being at the seashore, but it has a certain degree of energy and forces in play. Now, if it ordinarily, in a lot of cases, it'll be fine itself in withstanding that, but there might be certain cases where you might want to put in a kind of a breakwater, if you like, and that's a fairly not a big installation. It's something as simple as something floating in the water alongside the installation that just breaks that wave action up to make sure it's not taking the full pressure from that. So there's design features there that allow you to sit it in sort of more livelier waters, let's call it. In terms of that sort of drawdown of water you might get in drought conditions or general usage, it's quite surprising, actually. I must admit, Gary Connor, who's my colleague within the joint venture, he's sort of the engineering mind behind it. And I was asking that very same question a number of months back. And essentially, it's all in the moorings effectively, so that obviously the floating solar itself will move with the level of the water. It's just about the moorings having the elasticity, if you like, to be able to just drop down with it. So in theory, you can be talking, a fall of 10, 15 meters or so. It could withstand, generally speaking, to be able to drop the water level. So again, keep coming up with the answer, I suppose. It's the engineering, but there's some fairly well-travelled, well-rehearsed solutions to ensuring that flexibility is in the system. And you're right, that will be fundamental for quite a lot of the reservoirs and those sorts of features.
And in terms of the benefits, I mean, clearly renewable energy is a major benefit, but I think there are some other sort of spin-off or quite important ones as well. I think you mentioned things like potentially sustainable irrigation for the water companies. They can potentially help them reach net zero. Just so, what are the wider benefits other than renewable energy itself?
I think the big one, just repeating it very quickly, the preservation of valuable land, as we said before, that's an important aspect. I think given the constraints that we do have and the issues, be they political or actual, with food security or whatever it is, there's a definite benefit there. Water conservation, without a doubt, is another aspect of this. Now, we must temper that comment by the fact I've just told you, are we really going to cover out all water bodies completely? Clearly, the reduction in evaporation will be where the panels are. So in practical terms, it'll be largely restricted to that part of wherever you are in the reservoir. However, there is significant saving there. And I think my understanding is, and I might have this wrong, I'm not a water sector expert, but my understanding is we're looking at something like a 7% reduction or a sort of decrease in water supply up to 2045. Now, these percentages I'm going to give you don't offset that directly, but you can be looking with floating solar at something, it's in equatorial regions, so when you're getting to the really warm climates, up to about 40% reduction in evaporation. In the UK, more temperate climates, they reckon it's around about 20-25% reduction, but still, quite significant. If you apply that to irrigation ponds, for example, which is something we're looking at the moment in a European country, where it is very warm most of the year, and pressures on water resource are already there all year round. This is something we're looking at particularly there, where you might seek to cover a whole purpose irrigation reservoir to try and reduce that as much as the power that the site needs itself for irrigation purposes. So there's a definite benefit around that. Algal blooms is another one. We're hearing from a lot of people who've deployed at reasonable level now internationally, talking of algal blooms and the reduction they're seeing there. So the shading across that, which again is of interest to certain sectors and certainly the water sector. So that's another aspect. I suppose the one or two other things are, as I mentioned, if I call it not regeneration, but repurposing brownfield land. There's that big debate with Labour recently about grey belt and brownfield land and solar and brownfield land, and there's a moot point there of how realistic that is. But in a sense, floating solar is already there with that. In that, if we can repurpose, particularly things like quarry pits, then you're in a place where you're not using greenfield land. So there's a benefit there in the reuse of that land. Mentioned harbours again. That's, I suppose, that's speaking specifically to the burden that's being placed upon them in the decarbonisation field. Usually a land holding doesn't have much land. Land's at a premium at ports and harbours, and they need it for all the activities. So if you can use dead spaces of water, if they have any, then clearly you have a benefit there to help them get to where they need to get to. And I think overall, actually, I think it does provide a very interesting and quite bespoke solution for those what they call hard to decarbonise industries. So industrial, the mineral side of things, ports and harbours that very often have industrial complexes around them. It's quite an interesting solution for all those sorts of areas as well. So there's quite a lot that comes with it. Some of those very much apply to ground-mounted solar and wind as well. They're not necessarily just exclusive to floating solar, but most of them are very much part and parcel of what you get with the installation.
And obviously, I mean, we're having this discussion mainly because the potential is significant, and yourselves, RSK and Nova Innovation, you've formed a joint venture,
yes.
AquaGen365. So
That's
just
right.
good to understand sort of a little bit about how that came about and sort of what pride. I guess it's early days, but I believe you've already got your first installation. So just talk us through, what's happened so far, if you can.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think so. The coming together really was a relationship over many years. RSK have been supporting Nova, who are better known, I would say, for their tidal stream expertise. They're a global leader with that. So that's essentially, in basic terms, what looks like a small wind turbine on the seabed. But that does diminish the challenge that they've overcome there, which is to master the seabed, which is probably one of the most hostile environments to generate energy. Essentially, if you put anything on a seabed, it just gets torn apart. So, there's a really good job in getting on top of that. And Nova are bringing that sort of knowledge. There's a word that they use very often, which is marinizing. And I suppose the way that in coming together with Nova, we're bringing at RSK a big group of people with a lot of expertise around that process of developing something. So together we kind of have the whole turnkey one-stop shop type of offering, if you like. So if somebody says, look, there's my piece of water, please go and do everything, we can do that. If they want to do a certain part of it, we can do that. But I think, what we recognize is that, particularly with Nova's knowledge of the marine environment, they could build in a cost-effective but really robust solution around that, because they've had to tackle the sea. And ultimately, as long as you don't over-engineer that for freshwater, then you've got a really robust structure. So it's taken a while to get that sort of relationship together. We got it over the line earlier this year. As you say, we deployed a unit in Leith Harbour. That's gone through, it feels like it's probably more than 6 storms we've all been through since last summer. But it's that sort of level of test, if you like, in a harbour. So it's that sort of near-shore environment. All's going well. It survived the test really well. The harbour are taking the energy off the. It's a very small unit. It's not particularly huge, but big enough to be able to test the viability of it. And we're in discussions, as I say, I can't divulge more than in Europe with a particular country and their water authority, and looking at irrigation ponds from their side of things. There's a difficulty in looking at reservoirs in that country at the minute because the legislation doesn't quite back up the notion of floating solar. But irrigation ponds are a little more of an easier proposition, and actually probably the more sensible place to start, where you can look at the effects of reduction of evaporation and the like. So we're in a position now where the two of us working together, we have a legal agreement, and AquaGen is our brand. And we're talking across different sectors at the moment, talking to various people. There are a couple of water companies we're talking to at the moment. And the first step, really, to be honest, Phil, is to be able to sort of look at the feasibility of a scheme, see what it says it can do, really, and what the financial strands are to what it looks like in terms of that performance. Because, ultimately, you're asking sectors to take a leap into a technology they may not be familiar with, not heard of before. There's a natural caution around those sorts of things. We understand that it's all these things have to start somewhere. So I think part of the challenge looking ahead will be as much about people feeling comfortable with what it is. At the end of the day, it's a solar panel you and I would stick on our roof. It's no different. It's just we're sticking it on a float. Effectively is what we're doing. So we're just mounting it on something different, essentially. So there's no need to fear it in that sense. But as is the way with things, we understand it still has that degree of, well, hang on a minute, there's other technologies. Why don't I just use those? So you have to look at these things in the round back to those additional benefits you were talking around you now talking around the benefit of avoiding certain land use, the water conservation. It's all taken in the balance, really, in terms of how you do things. So yeah, so it's relatively early days, but we're pretty optimistic given the potential.
And is there a standard sort of financial model for how it operates? Because obviously there's a capital cost of building it, then operating it, and the electricity. Are there different financial models, or is there a standard way of you do it so that everyone sort of wins out, as it were?
Yeah, most people, I believe that they might do something with it to make it more bespoke, and they will do in terms of their own design. So there's a few software models you can use which are really good from the feasibility side, and they're very detailed. They can give you an awful lot. In fact, if you subscribe individually, they would always they can design out a scheme for you and cost it up. But clearly, from our perspective, we are sort of fabricators and manufacturers of our own solutions. So you have to do a certain degree of tweaking of the numbers to reflect what it is that you do in your design. So it's a bit of a mix, really. But by and large, you'll tend to find there's a lot of research out there in terms of where floating solar has got to. And I think there's a reasonable average in knowing that our floating solar installation will be a certain cost. And usually what you'll see is a quote per megawatt installed tends to be the figure that's used. So everybody can just in their heads go, okay, right, that's where we're at. So there's a pretty standard approach to it. And I suppose the key here is that, again, it's in the balance of all the other sorts of benefits you might get with any installation, but it's weighing up not only is it necessarily the cheapest form of energy you can get, it might not always be completely the cheapest, but is it much cheaper than what you're getting off the grid? Because very often that's the comparison you're making at that point is how much better is it than imported energy, which we all know is still very expensive. So there'll always be, and you'll see there's many a graph out there on the web showing you the comparison from oil and gas through to solar and wind around the world, and they're all variably up and down, and floating solar is no different. It's not too far off a ground-mounted solar. Clearly, being a new technology, I don't think you believe me if I said it's as cost-effective as ground-mounted solar. When you've got that difference of deployment, of course it isn't, but it's not far off. And I think, as with ground-mounted solar, we will see quite a significant fall away in terms of the capex and parity with ground-mounted solar in the not-too-distant future. So, and it's certainly much more cost-effective than what you're exporting in from the grid. So, but each site, it's fairly quick and easy to produce a pretty detailed estimate around what it might look like, and to be able to compare that to basically your energy bills, as an operator, to see what you're paying each year and how that works. A key factor in all of this, though, of course, is the energy profile of what you're putting in. So deepest, darkest Scotland, putting in solar, you're going to get a sweet spot around a certain number of months in the year where it'll be powering along really well. Other obvious times of the year in the winter where it's perhaps not doing quite so well. So, of course, there are sort of nuances around that about how how much supply you get all year round, and how you can size it to optimize that output. But that's really into the weeds of the detail. But yeah, there's some fairly standard approaches to how you do that.
Okay, and maybe just finally, in terms of the sort of future, both for the joint venture and just floating solar, I mean, is there any sort of objectives you set yourself or the industry more widely, as to you know, give some figures up front, but are you sort of confident that it's going to gain some real momentum, or do you need to make sure that you get these key sort of installations, sort of reference installations, and then things will snowball? Just anything you can share, I guess, as to how you think it's going to progress.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some barriers there. I think not anybody purposefully getting in the way. I think it's just not having sort of the same support, maybe, or the sort of, it's not on the radar as much as it needs to be. Whether it be central government, whether it's local authorities, and there's maybe not so many of us looking at deploying it at the moment. Although that number does feel like it's growing. It feels like this year it's really sort of taken hold quite a bit now, and the utilities are also really looking at it seriously now. I think the one thing which that roadmap, I think I mentioned earlier, that they were in the middle of producing. Hopefully, we see that coming out the other side of the Labour government coming in, and we're pretty hopeful that there is some inclusion of floating solar in that, which will hopefully give it the policy platform to support and really raise the profile so everybody's aware of it. I think the subsidy mechanism, so the CFD subsidy mechanism, which is really the cornerstone subsidy-wise of the renewable sector, floating solar isn't in there yet. Understandably, it hasn't really shown its hand yet. But to create some parity there with the other technologies, needs to be some recognition in that subsidy mechanism at some point in the near future. I think maybe we'll need that greater certainty in terms of planning regimes. That there maybe is a little bit of uncertainty. Permitted development rights, do they apply, do they not? Sometimes, if they don't apply, you're then into that. There is a thing. I mean, I'm by trade an environmental impact assessment specialist. And I know from more years than I can remember that when the new thing comes, there's a lot of fear, and it doesn't matter what that new thing is, it's new. And so I think that there is an element there where authorities can tend to knee-jerk react and ask for everything. So we've actually had it already where we were looking at a very small installation, no more than 0.5 megawatt. So you're talking something that is maybe a quarter of a hectare or something like that, very small sort of installation, and they immediately said an EIA is needed, a full environmental impact assessment. And the notion was that if that was a ground-mounted solar scheme, it wouldn't need one. So and that's not the basis on which to ask for something like that. So it's just an example of I'm not blaming the authority in that sense. I just get it that there's an inherent fear sometimes that there's a new thing coming. I'm not quite sure what it is. So again, that can have a really significant drag on the deployment of technologies if you're having to go through all these hoops. So that there's those sorts of barriers to it, I think. And if we can get beyond those, which I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't, and it's on us and others in the industry to make sure that happens. If the will is there, I am sure it will happen. I was there at the beginning of the wind boom in 2000, and everybody was going, "It's really going to happen." And before you know it, explosion! It just off it goes. I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen here. I think the water sector will take the lead. I think the water sector already has 3 operational schemes in play and been operated for many years. They have the bigger resource. They manage it. To my mind, I think they're the guys who are really going to lead us into the market, and for fairly obvious reasons, I guess. But there will be these other areas, I think ports and harbours, I think, and the industrial side of thing, which I think will follow suit as well. And then the marine environment, I think, as I said, we see that as a bit more of a distant horizon, really, just as much for commercial reasons as anything else. But yeah, no, we're super optimistic. If I was being honest, we're a bit concerned that we keep on top of the opportunities more than the other way around. But I think there are these initial hurdles to get over in terms of the psychology of the new thing, and asking people to have some thought about sticking electrical equipment in water is another one that's quite interesting. There's nothing wrong with that. We do that all the time. But there's certain things that you can understand people just jolt at hearing sometimes. So again, that's on us to provide people assurances, really.
It's just been absolutely brilliant to chat to you. Some fascinating insights into the world of floating solar. And maybe we can catch up sort of second half towards the end of the year and see what else has happened. But at least for now, Mike, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.